While the Great Crusade expanded with ruthless momentum, the reunion of Primarchs was not merely a logistical gain, it introduced immense ideological variance into the Imperial framework. Each world where a Primarch had landed had imprinted on him a different worldview, customs and philosophy. On Fenris, Leman Russ had grown up amid blizzards, tribal hunts and war beasts, embodying strength through endurance. On Barbarous, Mortarion survived among the dead, resisting necrotic overlords and breathing poisonous air his gene-enhanced lungs could barely tolerate. These environments didn't just alter tactics, they forged temperament. Vulcan of Nocturne embraced artisanal craftsmanship and a near-paternal love for his people, while Ferrus Manus, moulded by Medusa's hostile metallic terrain and resource scarcity, viewed efficiency as morality. The Emperor had designed them as reflections of human potential. What he recovered were fractured reflections, not broken, but not aligned. Each Primarch carried the burden of being both a symbol and a soldier. Even before their legions reunited with them, many had become rulers in their own right. Rabut Guilliman had transformed Macragge into a near-utopian state by the time the Emperor arrived. Lionel Johnson had hunted monsters through Caliban's wilds, cleansing its ancient ruins of warp-tainted entities before being crowned Lord. These feats were not merely military accomplishments. They illustrated a capacity for governance, philosophy, and cultural leadership. But those same traits often clashed with Imperial doctrine. Angron, for instance, bore the nails, neural implants that stifled emotion and enhanced rage, remnants of a life spent in the pits of Nuceria. Rather than heal or counsel him, the Emperor had forcibly extracted him from his gladiatorial army, letting them die to fulfill the larger war plan. That decision marked a permanent fracture in their bond. These weren't just differences in upbringing, they were wounds the Emperor did not bother to mend. For a time, the legions operated in synchrony. When a Primarch took command of his gene sons, the legion often underwent significant cultural shifts. The Word-bearers, originally focused on compliance and structured faith in the Emperor's vision, turned toward open religious devotion under Lorga's leadership. The Night Lords became purveyors of terror, shaped by Conrad Curse's belief in punishment as justice. This evolution was not unnoticed. The Emperor had hoped their loyalty would override their idiosyncrasies, but in reality it gave each legion a second identity, one that often diverged from Imperial unity. Some Primarchs viewed their sons as extensions of themselves. Others, like Perturabo, saw them as instruments, useful only when deployed and discarded when flawed. Even the most loyal, Sanguinius, Dawn, Vulcan, carried private doubts about the scope and cost of compliance. While most Imperial citizens would never see a Primarch, their presence radiated through every echelon of the Imperium structure. At an average height of over 3 meters, with musculature engineered for superhuman strength and minds designed for tactical foresight, each Primarch was a living legend. Their armor, often custom-forged, became symbols of identity and doctrine. Horus wore the Serpent Scales, a Baroque suit of power armor layered with defensive sorcery and tech arcana gifted by the Mechanicum. Guilliman's armor was clean, sleek, functional, a design philosophy that mirrored his governance. Curse's battle plate resembled a predator's silhouette, dark and jagged, meant to instill dread before engagement. These were not just suits, they were statements. Each weapon they wielded, each banner they bore became part of a growing mythology that blurred the line between propaganda and memory. The Emperor's central mistake was not in creating the Primarchs, it was in assuming their loyalty could be controlled by logic alone. His reliance on secrecy and silence, often justified as necessary for efficiency, left emotional vacuums his sons could not fill. They admired him, many loved him, but they could not understand him, and he offered no interpretation. When he withdrew to Terra, focusing solely on the Webway project, he left not a legacy, but a rift. Some Primarchs tried to emulate his example in their own way. Others saw it as a betrayal. Horus, who had once stood at the Emperor's right hand, felt the shift most acutely. He had led the Lunar Wolves to hundreds of victories, guided the Crusade with flexibility and charisma, and for his efforts, received command but not clarity. It was during this period of confusion that Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-bearers, planted the first seeds of rebellion. Erebus was subtle. Unlike the brutish zealotry he later displayed, his early manipulation was calculated and precise. He used the interlegion politics, Horus's isolation, and the warp's latent influence to sow doubt. During the campaign on Davin, a strategically unremarkable planet, Horus was mortally wounded by a warp-tainted weapon. As his body lay dying, Erebus convinced the Mournival, Horus's closest advisors, to place him in a serpent temple to undergo a ritual of healing. What occurred was no healing. Horus's soul was cast into a warp vision, a simulation crafted by the ruinous powers, where he witnessed a future where the Emperor became a god, enslaving his sons and betraying their sacrifices. The vision was false, but its emotional impact was genuine. When Horus awoke, he was changed. He had not been corrupted by power, he had been convinced by illusion. At this point, the Horus Heresy did not begin with declarations or banners. It began with whispers, altered deployments, and feigned compliance. Horus started rotating officers he suspected of loyalty to the Emperor. He restructured command chains and altered war plans to test Legion response. In parallel, Lorgar, already condemned by the Emperor for promoting religious worship, shifted his word-bearers fully into occultism, guided by the Chaos Gods under Erebus and Corphaeron. The corruption was systemic and slow. Fulgrim, proud and obsessed with perfection, was ensnared by the Slaaneshi blade known as the Lair Blade. Magnus the Red, ever curious and defiant, committed a critical error when he violated the Webway project through sorcery to warn the Emperor of Horus's fall and only to damage the entire endeavour and be declared a traitor. These were not grand betrayals. They were compounded missteps, character flaws exploited by powers older than the stars. The heresy formally ignited during the Isstvan III atrocity. Though subtle manipulations and covert corruption had begun years prior, it was on this war-torn world that Horus made his intentions fully known, not through political declaration, but mass murder. Isstvan III was originally targeted for compliance. Horus deployed forces from 4 legions, his own Lunar Wolves, now renamed Sons of Horus, Angron's World Eaters, Fulgrim's Emperor's Children, and Mortarian's Death Guard. Among the troops sent planetside were individuals known for their loyalty to the Emperor, handpicked by Horus under the guise of a standard assault. Once boots hit the ground, Horus ordered an orbital virus bombing of the entire region. Billions of civilians and thousands were liquefied in seconds, reduced to genetic slurry by the Life Eater virus. Firestorms followed to sterilize the surface. This was not a tactical necessity. It was a purge. The loyal within the traitor legions had to be eradicated before open war could begin. Despite Horus's ruthlessness, the cull was not total. A contingent of Loyalist Astartes survived, shielded by bunkers or sheer misfortune. Realizing the betrayal, they rallied under Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, and others who refused to break. What followed was a brutal ground war between battle brothers, men who had fought beside each other for decades, now turned into mortal enemies. The Loyalists made use of Isstvan III's terrain, decaying infrastructure, and captured enemy weapons to hold out against superior numbers. Angron himself descended to the surface in fury, leading assaults personally to crush the resistance. The Loyalists bought time with their lives, delaying Horus's plans and getting warning messages off-world. These messages would shape the coming campaigns and, critically, alert the Emperor to the betrayal. In response, the Imperium prepared the Isstvan V retaliation strike, what was meant to be a hammer blow to crush Horus early and end the rebellion before it spread. 7 legions were deployed. Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard led the first wave, with 4 others in reserve, the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Word-Bearers and Iron Warriors. The drop-site assault began with traditional Astartes precision, armoured landers, orbital bombardments, coordinated infantry pushes, but this was no standard campaign. As soon as the first wave was fully committed to the surface, the second wave opened fire, not on Horus, but on their supposed allies. The drop-site massacre lasted mere hours, but its consequences echoed across the galaxy. Vulcan was captured. Ferrus Manus was decapitated by Fulgrim. Corax barely escaped with his life. Thousands of loyal Astartes were vaporized by orbital strikes. Horus's gambit had worked. The heresy now had momentum, and it was no longer covert. The massacre shattered the illusion of Imperial unity. Until Isstvan V, there had been hope that Horus was merely misled or operating independently. Afterward, it became evident that at least half the legions Astartes, some of the most powerful military tools in human history, had openly turned against Terra. Legions that had once marched side by side now bombarded one another with cyclonic torpedoes and chemical munitions. The psychological damage to Imperial command structures was immense. Trust between surviving Loyalist forces became fragile. Every fleet, every new command order had to be scrutinized for possible corruption. The political fallout was no less severe. Several planetary governors began withholding resources, unsure which side to support. Others turned to faith, seeing the heresy as punishment for the Emperor's godlessness. Cult activity spiked across dozens of sectors. The warp grew louder. The Lunar Wolves' transformation into the Sons of Horus was not merely aesthetic. It represented Horus's full rejection of his former identity. The Legion's colour scheme was altered to sea green and black. Their iconography shifted to the Eye of Horus, a symbol drawn from ancient Terran occult scripts that eerily resembled the Eye of Terra itself, perhaps by design. Within the Legion, loyalty became enforced not through doctrine, but fear and shared guilt. Garviel Loken and those like him had been erased, not forgotten. The Mournival, once a trusted advisory body of seasoned warriors, was reshaped into a cabal of ideologues and fanatics. Abaddon, first captain, grew into a figure of absolute aggression, distancing himself from any brotherhood that had not fully embraced the Warmaster's new vision. The change was not merely mental. Many began experimenting with warp rituals and techno-arcana banned under Imperial law. Their gene seed remained stable, for now, but their spirits were already warped. The Emperor's response was measured but slow. He had not foreseen the depth of corruption, nor the strategic losses at Isstvan. With the Webway project catastrophically damaged by Magnus's intrusion, the Emperor was forced to deploy the Custodian Guard to hold the breach, draining even more resources from the front lines. He tasked Malcador the Sigillite with rallying Loyalist factions, enforcing order, and preparing Terra's defences. At the same time, Rabot Guilliman was ordered to form a secondary line of governance, the Imperium Secundus, in case the Sol system fell. It was not treason, it was contingency. But such actions fueled paranoia. Dawn, preparing Terra's defences and leading Imperial Fist fleets to intercept Horus's expansion, interpreted these moves with suspicion. The unity between Primarchs, already fragile, was breaking under the weight of war. By the close of the opening phase, the Horus Heresy was no longer a rebellion. It was a civil war stretching across thousands of light years. Over 1/3 of the Imperium's military power was now either compromised or actively hostile. The traitor legions carved a bloody path toward Terra, consuming planets, annihilating civilian populations, and turning Forge worlds against their Mechanicum brethren. New alliances formed in the shadows. Dark Mechanicum elements began producing demonic war engines. Cults of the ruinous powers sprouted within ships, planets, even among human regiments. Every victory won by the Loyalists came at the cost of trust, manpower, and stability. Every delay gave Horus more time to solidify his empire of rot. The galaxy, once ruled by cold logic and precise conquest, had become a storm of betrayal, broken faith, and escalating horror. The fall of the legions Astartes into rebellion was not spontaneous, nor was it equal. Each of the 9 traitor legions fractured under pressure points unique to their structure, culture, and gene line. While the warp influenced them, it did not strip away personal accountability. Their fall was not the fault of chaos alone. It was pride, ambition, rivalry, spiritual hunger, and ideological fracture that shaped each descent. As the Warmaster secured his grip, he did not simply rally them, he mirrored and amplified their flaws. The legions did not betray the Imperium in lockstep. They spiraled individually, each losing itself in a way that was terrifyingly personal. The Sons of Horus serve as the exemplar. Once known as the Lunar Wolves, they embodied the ideal Astartes, tactically perfect, fiercely loyal, and brutal in execution. Horus Lupercal's charisma created a sense of unity rare among legions. However, this unity hinged entirely on Horus himself. When he fell, they fell with him. After taking the name Sons of Horus, their culture evolved rapidly. Rituals, oaths, and martial pride were stripped down and replaced with absolute devotion to Horus. Their armour changed from clean whites and greys to sea green. Their tactics leaned heavier on terror and psychological warfare. Officers like Abaddon embraced war not as duty, but identity. The Legion's flaw became their dependency. When Horus eroded, so did their purpose. The Emperor's children fell fastest and furthest. Their obsession with perfection, in form, sound, precision, began as martial excellence. Fulgrim, their Primarch, embodied the artist-warrior ideal, but in pursuit of perfection, they found indulgence. After being exposed to a layer blade corrupted by Slanesh, Fulgrim's degeneration accelerated. He murdered Ferrus Manus at Isstvan V, a brother and close friend, with his own hands. The Legion turned to sensory extremes, layering excess upon excess. Battles were fought not for victory but for sensation. Sound-based weaponry replaced traditional arms. Armour was modified with stimulants, stimulators, and expressive enhancements. Their ships became galleries of flesh and chrome, and their war cries became symphonies of agony. What began as flawless execution descended into theatre. The World Eaters were always an unstable force. Their gene line carried the imprint of rage, a flaw that Angron's trauma amplified to apocalyptic levels. Ripped from Nuceria's gladiator pits and implanted with the butcher's nails, cybernetic implants that suppressed calm and stimulated aggression, Angron's arrival marked the death of restraint. The implants were soon distributed across the entire Legion. No Legion bled more for victory, and none were less restrained. Once Horus turned, Angron required no convincing. The World Eaters threw themselves into every engagement with a madness that bordered on suicidal. Chainswords replaced bolters as primary weapons. Their armour bore scars of their own brothers. As the heresy progressed, they became berserkers in the truest sense, lost to hunger, rage, and bloodshed. No strategic merit was required, only carnage. The Death Guard under Mortarion collapsed under stagnation. Obsessed with endurance and stoicism, Mortarion had built his legion into siege masters and chemical warfare specialists. But his hatred of the Warp and Psychers made him vulnerable. When Warp storms stranded the Death Guard fleet in the Imperium, Mortarion refused to ask for aid. For weeks the Legion suffered plague and mutation, rotting alive in their armour. Finally, Mortarion begged for release. Nurgle answered. The Legion was reborn in agony. Their armour bloated and rusted, maggots nested in their lungs, and yet they no longer died. The Death Guard lost all sense of time. Pain became endurance, disease became resilience. Their philosophy calcified into entropy. They no longer sought to win, only to outlast. The Thousand Sons did not fall by choice. Their damnation was consequence. Magnus the Red, a psyker of unmatched ability, sought knowledge above all. His legion mirrored this, wielding sorcery and psychic talent as their primary arsenal. When Magnus attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal through forbidden means, he shattered the Webway project and earned the Emperor's wrath. Sanctioned for destruction, the Thousand Sons defended Prospero against the Space Wolves. In desperation, Magnus made a pact with Tzeentch. Their homeworld was annihilated, but the Legion survived, transfigured. Many devolved into dust and soul-trapped suits of armour, the Rubric Marines bound by sorcery. Their flaw was intellectual arrogance, the belief that knowledge could shield them from consequence. It could not. The Word-bearers were already traitors before the heresy began. Lorgar, their Primarch, had long worshipped the Emperor as a god. When the Emperor condemned this belief and punished the Legion for their piety, Lorgar's faith fractured. He sought the gods that did answer, the Chaos Pantheon. Years before the heresy, the Word-bearers were already building the foundations of chaos worship across the galaxy, in cults, corrupted churches, and temples hidden within compliant worlds. They orchestrated the destruction of Calth, corrupted the Ultramarines' rear lines, and acted as spiritual leaders within the traitor ranks. Their strength was belief. Their flaw was the same. They replaced one god with four, and knelt to powers they could not understand. Their armour bore scripture, their weapons were relics, and their war cries were sermons. The Night Lords never fit the Imperial mould. Even before their fall, they were a legion shaped by fear, not loyalty. Their Primarch, Conrad Kurz, was a prophetic figure tormented by visions of doom and a personal philosophy rooted in punishment. Born on Nostramo, a planet suffocated by crime and apathy, Kurz became a tyrant who enforced law through unrelenting brutality. His legion reflected this, and they turned fear into doctrine. Armour was painted black and midnight blue, adorned with lightning bolts and flayed skin. They decorated cities with corpses as warnings and operated primarily through shock and psychological trauma. Unlike other traitor legions, they did not fall to chaos. They simply gave up pretending to be loyal. Their rebellion was not about power or belief. It was nihilistic retribution against an Imperium they viewed as hypocritical. The Night Lords, lacking a unified purpose, fractured early. Their campaigns became raids, their fleets decentralized. Many of them no longer fought for Horus, but for vengeance and the thrill of fear. The Iron Warriors fell through resentment. Their Primarch Perturabo was a strategic genius relegated to a thankless role, siege warfare. While the Ultramarines were celebrated, the Iron Warriors were buried in trench warfare, star fortresses, and attritional campaigns with little recognition. Decades of unappreciated sacrifice hardened the Legion. They became methodical, grim, and increasingly embittered. Their armour bore no flair. Their ranks adopted discipline more akin to machine processions than warriors. Their fall was not emotional or mystical. It was logical. When offered the chance to turn against an Imperium that had discarded them, Perturabo calculated the odds and made the call. The Iron Warriors became brutalist in every sense, tearing down cities with mathematical cruelty, replacing honour with result. They later embraced demon engines and corrupted war machines, turning their siegecraft into apocalyptic destruction. Perturabo's defining flaw was pride buried beneath bitterness. He did not seek to rule, only to be recognised, and when that never came, he turned his brilliance to devastation. The Alpha Legion remained the most enigmatic. They did not fall in a visible, dramatic way. Their Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon, twin brothers who operated as one, led a legion built on misinformation, subterfuge, and deep infiltration. Their armour was sea green, sleek, minimalistic, often without heraldry. The Alpha Legion operated with cell-based networks, sometimes with operatives embedded for decades before activation. When they joined Horus, it was not clear to many whether they had truly turned. Even now, Imperial records remain conflicted. The most controversial theory, presented in Legion by Dan Abnett, suggests that the Alpha Legion turned against the Emperor not out of betrayal, but because a cabal of Xenos psychers convinced them that the Emperor's survival would ensure humanity's doom. If this theory holds, their treachery was in fact an act of calculated salvation. This, however, remains non-canon and subject to interpretation. On the battlefield, the Alpha Legion used proxy forces, sabotage, and misinformation to undermine enemy morale and coordination. Their greatest asset was confusion. Their flaw, ironically, was the same. Their own warriors often did not know the truth. By the midpoint of the heresy, the warp had begun to imprint more deeply on the traitor legions. Rituals became daily routines. Uniforms changed not only aesthetically but structurally. Armour warped, melded, or bloated depending on the god they served. The Word-bearers began conducting demon rituals before major engagements. The Death Guard stopped removing their armour entirely, letting it rot into their flesh. Emperor's Children ships became pleasure vessels, their bridge crews replaced with surgically altered thralls. The Thousand Suns, decimated by the rubric spell, now relied on sorcerers as both leaders and logistics officers. Even those who resisted overt chaos worship, like the Night Lords and Iron Warriors, began to suffer mutation or internal division. The legions no longer resembled the armies that had conquered the galaxy during the Great Crusade. Tactically, their philosophies diverged sharply. The World Eaters preferred direct assaults and attrition, often without regard for allied positioning. The Alpha Legion moved entirely in the shadows, sometimes attacking fellow traitors to maintain their secrecy. The Sons of Horus adopted fast strikes and combined arm shock tactics. The Death Guard formed unbreakable phalanxes, allowing enemies to break themselves upon them. Each legion's battlefield performance mirrored its psychological state. The Emperor's children often inflicted civilian massacres for sport. The word-bearers converted prisoners or sacrificed them mid-battle. The strategic unity that once bound the legions Astartes shattered. The Warmaster kept control only through influence, fear, and mutual interest. As the war drew closer to Terra, their individual mutations and obsessions deepened. The warp was no longer merely an influence, it became a habitat. Ships of the traitor fleets were increasingly distorted. Reality aboard their vessels was unreliable. Some ships, like the Isstvan, remained half stuck in time due to warp interference. The Sons of Horus flagship, Vengeful Spirit, became a temple fortress, with entire decks dedicated to ritual and sacrifice. The word-bearers built cathedrals within their vessels, where demons were summoned between jumps. Across the fleet, mutations were no longer anomalies. Many World-Eaters grew bone crests or distorted limbs. Emperor's children captains modified their vocal cords into weaponized shrieks. Death Guard Marines oozed infection from joints, using disease as artillery. These weren't malfunctions, they were now integrated tools of war. In leadership, fractures formed rapidly. Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, began challenging Horus's decisions, though he remained loyal until the siege. Fulgrim vanished for periods of time, succumbing to his own inner demons. Angron could not be controlled, often requiring multiple fleets to trail him just to redirect his berserker incursions. Lorgar became a prophet more than a general, and Perturabo increasingly withdrew into logistical command. Alpharius and Omegon remained elusive, with entire warfronts doubting if the Alpha Legion was present at all. The unity Horus once wielded began to decay. Paranoia, ambition, and spiritual divergence pulled at every corner. By the time the traitor forces reached Terra, they were no longer cohesive legions in the traditional sense. Internal instability was common, fueled by competing ideologies, demon worship, and personal rivalries. Tactical discipline had given way to brutal pragmatism or manic excess. The siege itself was not just a physical campaign, it was spiritual warfare made manifest. Within the walls of the Imperial Palace, the defenders faced not only bolters and blades, but sorcery, corruption, and reality itself breaking down. Several legions arrived late or fragmented. The Night Lords, divided and chaotic, contributed irregular assaults and assassinations but refused to fully commit. The Alpha Legion was largely absent, its true role in the siege still debated by Imperial scholars. The Emperor's children conducted horrifying massacres within the palace walls, leaving even fellow traitors disturbed. Their sensory and surgical augmentations made them unpredictable. Many fought while playing orchestral devices embedded into their armour. Horus's decision to lower the defences of the Vengeful Spirit, drawing the Emperor and his champions aboard, signalled the climax. By then, Horus was deeply transformed, not just in body, though he'd grown to massive proportions and his armour had taken on demonic traits, but in psyche. He no longer believed in unifying humanity. He had become an avatar of chaos undivided, and saw Terra's fall not as a strategic necessity, but as a spiritual victory. Yet, even as he duelled the Emperor, cracks appeared in the unity of his followers. The word-bearers, whose religious fervour had ignited the heresy, were now acting in pursuit of their own ascension. The Death Guard, driven by rot and plague, ignored central orders in favour of spreading contagion across the palace. The World-Eaters, unleashed and uncontrollable, often attacked allies as much as enemies. The legions were no longer following the Warmaster, they were following their own gods, their own madness. When Horus was slain by the Emperor, at the cost of the Emperor's own physical form, the cohesion of the traitor legions shattered completely. Without Horus as a unifying figure, old rivalries returned. The siege ended not with withdrawal, but with disintegration. Some legions, like the Sons of Horus, attempted to maintain central command, but this rapidly failed. The Iron Warriors and Word-bearers withdrew with the intent to consolidate power elsewhere. The Death Guard's retreat was plagued, literally, as warp infestations consumed many of their vessels. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children vanished entirely, retreating into the Eye of Terror. What followed was not organised defeat, but an exodus into the warp, the beginning of the Long War. In real space, the Imperium suffered deeply. but within the warp the traitors had begun their final transformation. The Eye of Terra became their sanctuary and prison. This vast warp storm, located near the Segmentum Obscurus, was a realm where reality was pliable and time lost consistency. Each legion claimed or was granted a domain within it. The Death Guard settled in the Plague Planet, a sphere of decay gifted by Nurgle. The Word-Bearers established demon worlds where worship and sacrifice continued without end. Fulgrim, having fully submitted to Slaanesh, ruled over palaces of excess and torment. The World Eaters, fragmented and nomadic, followed Angron across demon-held sectors, never settling. Their environments reflected their corruption. Demon engines roamed freely. Mutated beasts and hybrid war-spawned creatures filled their war zones. Civilization, as the Imperium understood it, ceased. These were not cities, but shrines of ruin. Their structures changed too. Legions gave way to warbands, often led by charismatic champions, chaos lords, or demonic entities. Leadership was fluid and violent. Promotions were earned through blood. The Iron Warriors retained some form of order, maintaining fortified holdings and using mortal auxiliaries. The Word-Bearers became ecclesiarchs of the Warp, founding cults and spreading demonology. The Emperor's children divided into hosts led by sonic champions or narcotic warlords. The Night Lords, rejecting demonhood and chaos itself, splintered into pirate fleets, preying on Imperial and traitor alike. The Alpha Legion remained elusive, operating through agents and proxies. Abaddon, emerging from the ruins of the Sons of Horus, eventually took the Black Legion name and vowed to finish what Horus began. But even this unification took centuries. Technologically, the legions no longer relied on Mars. They crafted their own war machines through dark pacts or biomechanical engineering. The Death Guard developed demon engines that spread plagues through atmospheric infusion. The Word-Bearers summoned warp entities into hulls of metal and bone. The World Eaters crafted juggernauts fused with the souls of the damned. Power armor became a living thing, often fused into flesh. Bolters whispered to their owners. Chainswords pulsed with hunger. Maintenance became ritual. Battle was both war and sacrament. Tactical efficiency gave way to spiritual significance. Sacrifice, whether of enemy, ally, or self, was currency for favour with the gods. Psychologically, the legions were no longer salvageable, centuries in the warp-distorted time perception. Many veterans of the heresy emerged millennia later, believing only decades had passed. Their perception of reality was warped. Memories failed, identity fractured. Many no longer remembered the names of their Primarchs. Others saw their Primarchs as gods, saints, or demons. The distinction between self and warp influence was gone. The Thousand Sons, for instance, saw their flesh-and-blood identity reduced to a handful of sorcerers commanding rubric shells, suits of armour inhabited by psychic echoes. The Emperor's children became living instruments. The World Eaters operated in permanent battle frenzy. Only the Alpha Legion appeared stable, though even this may be illusion. Yet, each legion left behind a legacy, visible in the Imperium's trauma and in the echoing wars still fought 10,000 years later. The Word-Bearers institutionalized chaos worship. The Iron Warriors introduced demon-forged fortresses that still plague Segmentum Obscurus. The Night Lords taught the Imperium the cost of fear-based governance. The Death Guard turned entire planets into uninhabitable carcasses. The Sons of Horus, through Abaddon, launched the Black Crusades. The heresy was over, but its embers remained alive in every renegade warband, every demon incursion, every shrine hidden beneath a hive city. The traitor legions were no longer sons of the Emperor. They were warlords, prophets, reavers, and beasts. Their fall had started with ideology. It ended in damnation. Even among the Loyalist legions, the heresy exposed painful vulnerabilities. The Ultramarines, the largest of all legions, were absent for much of the initial conflict, drawn into the massive trap that was the Battle of Calth. Rabut Guilliman, a tactician first and foremost, saw the heresy not just as treason, but as proof of institutional weakness. His response, once the heresy ended, was the Codex Astartes, a document that broke the legions into smaller chapters, enforcing structure through fragmentation. For the Ultramarines this was necessary. Calth burned, and the scars never fully healed. Their homeworld of Massacre stood strong, but Guilliman understood the reality. Unity had made the Imperium vulnerable. Independence had to become doctrine. The Blood Angels suffered in different ways. Sanguinius, second only to Horus in popularity, carried not just a legion but a myth. Noble, angelic, revered even by other Primarchs, he became a symbol of everything the Imperium wanted to believe about itself. His death at the hands of Horus shattered that image. His sons, already plagued by a psychic flaw known as the Red Thirst, a blood hunger inherited through unknown means, developed an even more severe condition, the Black Rage. This psychic echo of their Primarch's final moments caused many Blood Angels to go mad, re-experiencing Sanguinius's death in endless cycles. They would fight to the death, believing themselves to be the Primarch, hunting Horus who no longer existed. The flaw could not be cured. Entire units of these afflicted warriors were formed, the Death Company, led by chaplains into battle not for victory, but for release. The Dark Angels remained outwardly intact but were deeply compromised. At the height of the heresy, a civil war erupted within their own ranks. Luther, once Lionel Johnson's closest friend and second in command, had been left behind to govern Caliban while the Lion led the wider war. In the Lion's absence, Luther grew bitter. His jealousy and resentment gave chaos a foothold, leading to the Dark Angels' internal schism. When the Lion returned to Caliban, he found it in open rebellion. The planet was ultimately destroyed, shattered by orbital bombardment, and Luther was captured. The fallen Dark Angels, now known as the Fallen, scattered across the galaxy, sowing confusion and shame. The Dark Angels, obsessed with secrecy, hunted their own across 10 millennia, prioritizing silence over confession. To this day, the chapter operates under a veil of paranoia. The Iron Hands were broken at Isstvan 5. Their Primarch Ferrus Manus was killed by Fulgrim during the initial betrayal. For the Iron Hands, this was catastrophic. Ferrus was more than a leader. He was their measure of worth, their guiding machine logic. His death didn't lead to despair, but obsession. The Legion doubled down on cybernetic augmentation, believing flesh to be weak, inferior. Over time, this turned into outright disdain for biological limitations. They amputated, replaced, rewired. Emotion was treated like malfunction. Their successors followed suit. Where other legions mourned, the Iron Hands recalibrated, but they never recovered from Isstvan. Even in M41, they are driven by a near-hysterical need to prove their resilience. The Raven Guard nearly ceased to exist. At Isstvan 5, they lost over 80% of their number. Corvus Corax escaped only through sheer luck and tactical brilliance. Desperate to restore his legion, Corax returned to Terra and was granted access to the Emperor's genetic archives. Using these, he attempted to accelerate the growth of new Astartes, creating warriors in days rather than years. The results were horrifying. Many became unstable, monstrous, or barely controllable. Some were killed. Others were deployed regardless, sent into combat as temporary assets. Corax, haunted by guilt and failure, eventually disappeared into the Eye of Terror, seeking penance or oblivion. His legion never fully recovered, though it remained loyal. The Salamanders suffered heavy losses as well, and their Primarch Vulcan was presumed dead for much of the war. Unlike many other legions, the Salamanders remained deeply connected to humanity. They saw themselves as protectors, not conquerors. Their warfare was precise, designed to limit collateral damage. They believed in sacrifice with purpose. At Isstvan 5, they paid dearly for that principle. Vulcan's resilience, he was later revealed to be a perpetual capable of resurrection, made him a symbol of indomitable spirit. But his mind fractured over time. After the heresy, he vanished, wandering the galaxy in a state of madness. The Salamanders preserved his memory, but they too became smaller, more isolated, their idealism rarely mirrored by others. The White Scars and their Primarch, Jagatai Khan, played a more understated but pivotal role. Initially hesitant to commit to either side, the Khan ultimately sided with the Emperor, launching hit-and-run campaigns that disrupted traitor supply lines and strategic cohesion. His tactics were drawn from ancient Terran steppe warfare: mobility, unpredictability, and psychological pressure. After the heresy, the Khan returned to Chogoris but later disappeared into the Webway while fighting the Drukhari. The White Scars never sought glory. Their loyalty was absolute, but their legacy remains quieter, often overshadowed by louder names. Their doctrines influenced the development of fast attack chapters throughout the Imperium. The Space Wolves, led by Leman Russ, fought directly against the Thousand Suns during the burning of Prospero. Their reputation as savage but loyal warriors was both earned and manipulated. The Emperor used them as executioners, deploying them to enforce loyalty when diplomacy failed. After the heresy, Leman Russ gathered his warriors and vanished into the Eye of Terra, promising to return during the Imperium's greatest need. His absence created a myth, the Wolf King who would return at the end. The Space Wolves maintained their traditions, their isolation, and their fierce independence, often clashing with the Codex Astartes and other chapters. As for Terra itself, the Loyalists endured the brunt of the siege. The Imperial Fists, led by Rogel Dawn, were the principal architects of the palace defences. The White Scars and Blood Angels fought alongside them. After the Emperor's interment into the Golden Throne, Dawn was shattered. He saw the failure not as defeat in battle, but a failure of preparation. His later efforts to reform the legions were conflicted. He initially resisted the Codex Astartes, believing the splitting of legions to be an overreaction. Eventually, after significant loss and internal strife, he conceded. The Imperial Fists were divided, becoming foundational to the post-Heresy Astartes structure. The psychological impact on Loyalist Primarchs was severe. Guilliman assumed stewardship of the Imperium in the absence of the Emperor, initiating the Imperial Tactica, bureaucracy, and chapter-based reform. He became a statesman. Russ disappeared. Corax vanished. Dawn mourned. Vulcan wandered. Sanguinius died. The Lion fell into stasis. Most of the remaining Primarchs either withdrew or disappeared entirely. The Imperium was left to rebuild without them. The dream of unity under superhuman leadership was over. The Loyalists had won the war but lost their foundation. The surviving Astartes were no longer sons of heroes. They were inheritors of a shattered throne. The scouring began immediately after the siege of Terra. It was not a clean operation, nor swift. The Loyalist legions pursued the retreating traitors across the galaxy, system by system, purging entire sectors. Battles such as the Purge of Millennium, the destruction of Iduna's Reach, and the void conflict of Anvilus Prime lasted for decades. The traitor Primarchs fled into the Eye of Terra, transforming into demon princes or disappearing entirely. What was left of their legions became the first Chaos Space Marines, the seeds of the modern warbands. The Loyalists, exhausted but vengeful, were forced to accept a grim reality. This would not be a victory with parades or closure. It was a brutal cleanup of a universe that no longer made sense. This was the context in which Robert Guilliman proposed the Codex Astartes. Recognizing that the heresy had been possible because of the overwhelming power and independence of the legions, Guilliman advocated breaking them into smaller, self-regulating chapters of 1,000 Space Marines each. These chapters would no longer be attached to planetary fiefdoms and would instead serve broader Imperial objectives, coordinated by the newly established Adeptus Terra. Each would maintain its own traditions, heraldry and command structure, but with significantly reduced autonomy. This was a massive cultural shift. Many of the surviving Primarchs, especially Rogel Dawn and Vulcan, resisted the idea, seeing it as a punishment rather than reform, but Guilliman insisted it was a safeguard. In his eyes, this was about preserving the Imperium from within. The Second Founding formalised this shift. Over 20 new chapters were created from the Loyalist legions, including the Crimson Fists, Black Templars, and Aurora chapter. Each inherited specific gene seed traits, some with the same flaws. The Blood Angels passed on the Black Rage and Red Thirst. The Imperial Fist's successors shared their rigidity and martyrdom complex. Some chapters went on to become just as storied as their progenitors. Others quietly faded into obscurity or were lost during later wars. The split also weakened the unity and operational scale that the legions once commanded. No longer could a single Primarch mobilize a force to overwhelm a world. Instead, wars would now be fought by multiple chapters acting in coordinated but decentralized campaigns. It was efficient but colder, more bureaucratic. Culturally, this decentralization had deep effects. Legion identities, once tied to a single father figure and culture, were now diluted across time, distance, and interpretation. The Iron Hand successors, for instance, became even more obsessed with cybernetic purity, with some chapters like the Red Talons pushing beyond even Ferrus Manus' ideals. The Salamander's successors maintained their humanitarian approach, but lacked the same degree of connection to Nocturne's tribal culture. The Ultramarines and their successors, called the Primogenitors, came to dominate Imperial military doctrine due to their adherence to Guilliman's Codex. This created a kind of cultural monopoly that bred resentment among non-Codex compliant chapters, especially the Space Wolves and Dark Angels, who saw their ways as equally valid but constantly scrutinized. Living conditions for the Loyalist chapters post-heresy varied dramatically. The Raven Guard, nearly destroyed, operated out of secret bases and relied on stealth, infiltration, and psychological warfare. Their homeworld, Deliverance, was a hive world turned fortress. Grim, paranoid, designed to minimize exposure. The Space Wolves, still based on Fenris, retained their harsh tribal traditions, living among volcanic tundras, war rituals, and open hunts. The Ultramarines preserved Ultramar as a shining beacon of Imperial order, with Macragge becoming a hub of reconstruction and military coordination. Each chapter adapted to new realities, shaped by loss and necessity. But none escaped the shadow of the heresy. It informed every operational decision, every recruitment, every theological doctrine they adopted or rejected. The Codex did not solve all problems. In fact, many successors inherited internal schisms. The Black Templars, born from the Imperial Fists, openly defied the Codex's size limitations, forming crusades that exceeded thousands of Marines. The Flesh Tearers, a Blood Angel successor, struggled with uncontrollable bloodlust and were nearly declared excommunicate traitores. These examples highlighted that while the Codex could impose order, it could not rewrite genetic destiny, nor could it eliminate the psychological scars of the heresy. Many of the flaws the Primarchs had tried to suppress, pride, obsession, melancholy, persisted through their sons. The scouring had ended the war, but it had not healed the wounds. Even the administrative structure of the Imperium shifted in response. The High Lords of Terra were created to govern in the Emperor's name, forming the core of the Adeptus Terra. These bureaucrats, politicians, and military leaders represented the various branches of Imperial power: the Adeptus Mechanicus, Adeptus Astartes, Astra Militarum, Ecclesiarchy, and more. The Astartes became just one tool in the Imperial war engine. Many chapters resented this. They had bled for the Imperium, buried their fathers, and now were being told how to fight by mortals in gilded thrones. Some withdrew from politics entirely, becoming warrior monks. Others engaged in shadow diplomacy, influencing planetary governors, rogue traders, and Mechanicus factions to secure their interests. As centuries passed, the stories of the Loyalists became doctrine, then myth. The Emperor was no longer a general, but a god. Sanguinius was canonized as a martyr. Guilliman became a living saint. Even the vanished Primarchs became subjects of pilgrimage. This mythologizing helped bind the Imperium together but diluted the complexity of what had really occurred. The Loyalists were not flawless. They had made mistakes, failed their brothers, committed atrocities under the banner of necessity. But in the eyes of the Imperium they had done the impossible. They had stood against the Warmaster and endured. That endurance became their legacy, a warning, a model, and a curse. The closing phase of the Horus Heresy was marked by the relentless advance of Loyalist forces against the last bastions of Warmaster Horus and his traitorous legions. The Siege of Terra represented the ultimate struggle for the Imperium's survival, with the Imperial Palace itself transformed into a fortress city teetering on the edge of ruin. Ground operations were characterized by breakthrough assaults, designed to pierce the massive walls and layered defenses established by Horus. These operations required close coordination between the Imperial Guard, Adeptus Astartes, and mechanized units. The assault teams deployed extensive tunneling operations, sappers, and specialized breaching squads equipped with siege engines to dismantle the barricades constructed from adamantium and ceramite. The Loyalists' relentless pressure slowly eroded the defenders' positions, even as the defenders fought with desperate ferocity, augmented by demonic reinforcements and warp-enhanced fortifications. Simultaneously, orbital saturation bombing campaigns from the Imperial Navy sought to weaken the defenders' capacity for resistance by decimating supply lines, artillery emplacements, and troop concentrations. Star fortresses, battle barges, and frigates unleashed a continuous bombardment that layered the skies with molten fire and plasma storms. These bombardments were not without cost. The devastation wrought by countless macro cannons and torpedo salvos shattered entire districts, turning sprawling urban landscapes into wastelands of ash and twisted metal. Such destruction complicated Loyalist advances but was seen as necessary to dislodge entrenched enemies. Imperial commanders accepted the sacrifice of infrastructure and lives in the name of ultimate victory, framing the destruction as a grim but vital sacrifice to preserve humanity's future. This strategy, while effective in weakening Horus's forces, left Terra scarred, a testament to the immense toll the heresy inflicted on the cradle of mankind. The doctrine underpinning the final assaults was shaped by extermination orders issued by the High Lords of Terra, which mandated the complete annihilation of any forces or populations tainted by chaos or rebellion. These orders effectively sanctified the battlefield, elevating every Loyalist soldier's act of violence to a sacred crusade against corruption. The Krieg regiments, already notorious for their fanatical obedience and unyielding discipline, executed these orders with grim precision. Their infantry advanced with flamers, melter weapons, and heavy artillery support, systematically purging enemy-held positions. The extermination directive extended beyond military necessity, intertwining with ecclesiarchy dogma to create a battlefield sanctified by blood and fire. Soldiers were indoctrinated to view their actions not as mere war but as holy acts cleansing the Imperium of its darkest enemies. This ideological overlay intensified the ferocity of combat, driving forces to fight with unrelenting zeal. The presence of the Inquisition during the final battles was both strategic and symbolic. The Order Malleus and Order Hereticus took active roles in purging chaos corruption and rooting out heretical elements hiding within the traitor forces and civilian populations. Inquisitors wielded immense power, overseeing the use of sanctioned psychers and inquisitorial inquisitions to break enemy morale and dismantle warp-tainted strongholds. Their involvement ensured no taint, no whisper of demon or cult, escaped scrutiny. Beyond combat, inquisitorial agents interrogated prisoners, identified secret cults, and administered swift judgment upon those deemed beyond redemption. Their use of forbidden knowledge and arcane rituals complemented the military campaign, reflecting the Imperium's doctrine that victory required both physical conquest and spiritual purification. This fusion of military might and inquisitorial authority underscored the total war nature of the Horus Heresy's final chapter. The Krieg regiments endured some of the heaviest losses during the final assault, their soldiers often thrown into the most dangerous sectors where warp-tainted enemies and demonic presences were strongest. Their reputation as unbreakable shock troops was forged in these brutal engagements, where entire companies could be sacrificed to hold or seize critical ground. Their combat style emphasized attrition and fanaticism, advancing in unyielding waves despite devastating casualties. Many veterans emerged permanently scarred physically and psychologically, bearing witness to horrors wrought by demonic warp entities and corrupted human foes. Their success in the campaign came at a staggering human cost, but their effectiveness cemented the regiment's role as the Imperium's premier force for cleansing tainted worlds. The legacy of their sacrifices resonated deeply within Imperial military culture, influencing doctrine and inspiring new generations of soldiers to unwavering loyalty and ruthless efficiency. The enduring legacy of the Horus Heresy's final campaign influenced Imperial military doctrine for millennia to come. The brutal siege warfare, combined with relentless attrition and ideological sanctification of the battlefield, became a template for how the Imperium approached large-scale conflicts against heretics and warp-corrupted foes. The experience gained from Terra's defense and reclamation reinforced the importance of overwhelming firepower paired with fanatical infantry assaults, a hallmark of the Astra Militarum's later tactics. The Krieg regiments, forged in the crucible of the heresy's bloody conclusion, were often held as exemplars for other Imperial Guard formations, embodying unwavering discipline and the capacity to operate effectively in the most devastated and tainted environments. Doctrine emphasized that the sacrifice of entire regiments or populations was justified if it meant preventing the spread of corruption, an unforgiving pragmatism born of the heresy's bitter lessons. Vrax, although a later conflict, is often cited in the post-heresy Imperium as a grim echo of Terra's horrors, underscoring the necessity of total war doctrine. The prolonged siege and extermination campaign on Vrax reflected many principles born out of the Horus Heresy. The relentless eradication of chaos cultists, the use of scorched earth tactics, and the spiritual framing of war as a holy crusade. The cleansing of the warp taint and sealing of the dead world Terra was an immense ongoing effort following the final battles. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition collaborated closely to remove residual warp contamination. Psykers and sanctioned sorcerers were deployed to detect and contain lingering demonic incursions, while Mechanicus tech priests developed sophisticated devices to stabilize the psychic resonance of the planet. Quarantine zones were established to isolate sections where corruption lingered most fiercely, with orbital blockades preventing unauthorized access. Ancient ritualistic ceremonies, led by high-ranking ecclesiarchs, sought to sanctify the land, imbuing it with spiritual protection against future warp breaches. The Golden Throne itself was maintained as both a technological and spiritual keystone, its psychic beacon holding Terra's fragile warp defenses in place. These combined efforts reflect the Imperium's dual reliance on both faith and science to preserve its heart from chaos. The scars of the heresy remained etched into Terra's surface and psyche. Entire districts lay in ruins, inhabited only by scavengers and repair crews tasked with reconstruction. The Imperium's resources were stretched to maintain and rebuild its capital, balancing the demands of ongoing warfare across the galaxy with the necessity of preserving its symbolic and strategic centre. The psychological toll on survivors, veterans of the siege, commanders and civilians, was immense, yet suppressed under layers of doctrine and mythologizing that painted the Loyalists as near mythical heroes. This mythologizing served as a unifying narrative for a fractured Imperium, helping to bind together disparate worlds under a common story of sacrifice and survival. Yet beneath the surface lay lingering questions and doubts, suppressed and dangerous, about the cost and true nature of the Imperium's salvation. The aftermath of the Horus Heresy also saw significant shifts in the political and military structure of the Imperium. The Emperor's condition on the Golden Throne left the Imperium leaderless in practical terms, with the High Lords of Terra stepping into a governance role that blended bureaucratic control with religious authority. The Primarch Rabaut Guilliman's return centuries later, and his creation of the Codex Astartes, reflected an institutional attempt to prevent future rebellions by decentralizing Space Marine forces and embedding rigid command structures. These reforms were born of hard lessons learned from Horus's betrayal and the catastrophic civil war it sparked. The trauma of the heresy shaped the Imperium's paranoia and intolerance toward perceived heresy, influencing policies that tightened control over military and civilian populations alike. The legacy of betrayal cast a long shadow over every facet of Imperial life. In summation, the final assault and aftermath of the Horus Heresy crystallized the Imperium's dual identity as both a sprawling, brutal war machine and a deeply religious empire. The ruthless military operations, doctrinal sanctification of violence, and spiritual purges established patterns that continue to define Imperial warfare. The Herculean efforts to cleanse the warp taint and seal Terra ensured survival, but at a monumental cost, physically, morally, and culturally. The heresy's conclusion marked not just the end of a galaxy-shaking conflict, but the birth of a new Imperium defined by sacrifice, vigilance, and a grim determination to never again suffer such betrayal. This chapter's legacy reverberates through the grim darkness of the far future, a testament to both human resilience and the high price of survival. The climax of the final assault was the confrontation within the Imperial Palace itself. Loyalist forces fought through halls drenched in blood and shadow, where every step forward was contested by warbands of traitor marines and demonic entities summoned from the warp. The defenders, led personally by Warmaster Horus, utilized a combination of brutal close-quarters combat and devastating sorcery to slow the advance. Imperial commanders coordinated multi-pronged offensives, leveraging the strengths of different legions and Imperial Guard formations in synchronized strikes. These operations demanded immense logistical coordination under fire, maintaining supply lines through shattered corridors and rubble-strewn courtyards. The siege of the palace exemplified the horrific scale of the heresy's final phase, where brother fought brother amid the ruins of the Emperor's vision for mankind. Within this maelstrom, the involvement of the Inquisition was pivotal. Their agents hunted warp-tainted commanders and cultists infiltrating the Loyalist ranks, ensuring that no trace of corruption could fester behind the front lines. Their use of sanctioned psychers was essential in countering the demonic sorcery that bolstered Horus's forces. Inquisitorial operatives conducted swift and often brutal trials, excising suspected traitors and heretics before they could sow further discord. This uncompromising approach reflected the Imperium's understanding that victory required not only the physical defeat of Horus, but the absolute eradication of his spiritual contagion. The combined efforts of warriors and inquisitors forged a path through despair toward the final confrontation. As the battle reached its apex, the Emperor faced Horus aboard the Warmaster's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. Their duel was both physical and metaphysical, a titanic clash of willpower, martial skill and psychic might that shook the very foundations of the Imperium. The Emperor's victory came at a great cost. He was mortally wounded and forced onto the Golden Throne to sustain his life through arcane technologies. This sacrifice sealed the Imperium's future as a realm ruled by faith and bureaucratic guardianship, rather than direct imperial leadership. The Emperor's condition became a potent symbol of the Imperium's eternal struggle against chaos, a beacon sustaining hope even as the Imperium entered a prolonged age of decline and conflict. The aftermath for the Krieg regiments was marked by both honour and tragedy. Their fanatical loyalty and overwhelming sacrifices became legendary, yet entire companies were wiped out, and survivors bore lifelong wounds, physical and mental. These regiments exemplified the harsh realities of the heresy's final battles, where victory was measured in the blood of tens of thousands. Their actions influenced the future doctrine of the Astra Militarum, emphasizing total commitment to the Emperor's will regardless of cost. Memorials on Terra and across Imperial space commemorate their deeds, but the true human cost remains largely hidden beneath layers of Imperial propaganda. In the broader scope, the final phases of the Horus Heresy redefined Imperial military doctrine. The emphasis on saturation bombardments, extermination policies, and the integration of inquisitorial authority became permanent features of Imperial warfare. The Imperium embraced a model where war was total and uncompromising, blending technological might with religious zealotry. This paradigm shaped the Imperium's countless wars to come, embedding a culture of sacrifice, suspicion, and dogmatic purity. Ultimately, the cleansing of the warp taint on Terra and other battlefields was a prolonged, arduous process. The combined efforts of the Mechanicus, Ecclesiarchy, and Inquisition employed both technology and faith to seal rifts and purge corruption. Terra itself remains a nexus of psychic power and vigilance, its stability precarious yet vital. The scars of the heresy endure in the fabric of the Imperium, etched into its laws, rituals, and memories. They remind humanity that survival demands constant vigilance against betrayal, heresy, and the seductive darkness of the warp. This final chapter of the Horus Heresy stands as a monumental testament to the cost of rebellion and the resilience of loyalty. It shaped the Imperium's future, defining its identity as a realm perpetually at war with itself and the universe beyond. The heresy's legacy is etched into the annals of history, a story of tragedy, endurance, and the unyielding will to survive in a galaxy where hope is as fragile as the Emperor's final breath.